The Wendigo of the North Woods. It was the winter of 1993 when Kyle and his three friends, Jake, Mark, and Dave, went out on what was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. They had been planning the remote camping trip for months, eager to escape the busy pace of their everyday lives in Minneapolis. The North Woods of Minnesota, with its endless forests and snow-capped trees, seemed like the perfect getaway. Their idea was to leave behind the distractions of technology, city noise, and the pressures of work. The fresh, crisp air of the wilderness would cleanse them, body and soul. They arrived early in the afternoon, navigating the snow-packed roads that led deeper into the woods. The landscape around them seemed untouched, a sea of white stretching out as far as the eye could see. The trees stood like sentinels, thick and heavy in snow. There was a sense of peacefulness in the air, but also in an unsettling quiet that made Kyle's skin prickle. It was silence so deep that it almost felt unnatural, as if the forest was holding its breath. After driving for miles, they reached an old weathered cabin. It had clearly seen better days. With its wooden exterior darkened by age, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of the snow. Despite its disrepair, it looked sturdy enough to offer shelter from the cold. Kyle was excited by the rustic charm of it, and they quickly set up camp nearby, unpacking their gear and laying out sleeping bags in the cabin's sparse interior. As evening fell, the group gathered around a fire pit outside, the warmth of the flames pushing back against the chill of the encroaching night. The forest around them looked like a living painting, the tall trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. The wind picked up, howling through the branches, sending the occasional flurry of snow tumbling to the ground. The scene was picturesque, serene even, but something in the air felt off. Kyle couldn't place it, but the forest had a weight to it, as if something was watching them. The conversation around the fire was lighthearted at first. They shared memories of past trips, cracked jokes, and reminisced about old times. But as the night grew deeper and the temperature dropped further, the conversation turned to darker, more sinister topics. Jake, the self-proclaimed expert on all things supernatural, began telling the group about a local legend he had heard growing up. "You guys ever hear of the Wendigo?" he asked, his voice dropping lower, almost conspiratorially. Kyle, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "Jake, you know that stuff's just made up, right? Stories people tell to spook each other." But Jake wasn't so easily dissuaded. He leaned in closer to the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "The Wendigo wasn't just a story. It's real. There have been sightings right here in these woods. People have gone missing, disappeared without a trace. The locals don't talk about it much, but if you listen closely, you'll hear them whisper about it." Kyle wasn't sure if Jake was trying to get a rise out of them, or if he genuinely believed in the myth. Still, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that crept up his spine as Jake spoke. The Wendigo is a creature of hunger, Jake continued. It was once human, someone who resorted to cannibalism to survive in the harsh winters. But by doing that, they became something not human. It's cursed. Forever hungry, forever seeking more to consume. They say it haunts these forests, luring people in with its eerie call. Jake's voice seemed to grow more intense as he described the Wendigo's hunger, its twisted, emaciated form, and the tales of its victims. Those who were driven to madness, those who vanished without a trace. As he spoke, Kyle began to feel a chill that wasn't entirely from the cold night air. There was a heaviness to Jake's words that lingered, as if the Wendigo itself was watching them from the trees, listening. Mark, ever the joker, laughed and clapped Jake on the back. Come on, man. It's just an old legend. Nothing to be scared of. But even Dave, who had spent years as a hardened outdoorsman, looked uncomfortable. Jake might be onto something. I've heard strange things in these woods. Things I couldn't explain, he said. His eyes flickered toward the shadowed trees. For a moment, the group fell silent, the wind howling louder in the distance. Kyle couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. It was silly. He knew it was silly. But something about the night felt different. The fire crackled as they began to settle for the night. But Kyle couldn't sleep. The wind seemed to grow stronger, the trees outside groaning under its force. He kept hearing rustling sounds in the distance. But every time he tried to look out, all he saw were shadows. Around 2 a.m., he was startled awake by a strange sound. A low, deep growl that seemed to reverberate through the ground beneath him. Questioning it but scared, his heart raced as the growl grew louder, closer. Then suddenly, it stopped. Kyle's pulse quickened as he lay there in the dark, trying to make sense of what he had heard. He wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but the growl hadn't sounded like any normal animal he knew. It was a sound from somewhere deeper, darker. Then there came a scream, sharp, chilling, and full of agony. It was a scream unlike anything Kyle had ever heard before. Maybe in the movies. But he thought this wasn't a movie. It pierced the silence of the woods, echoing through the trees like a dark cry from the very depths of hell. Kyle jumped in his tent, breathing heavily, trying to process what he had just heard. He unzipped his tent, creeping out into the snow. The wind whipped around him, biting his skin. His breath came out in clouds of vapor as he scanned the campsite, heart hammering in his chest. Guys? Kyle said hoarsely, but there was no answer. The camp was eerily silent, the fire reduced to a few flickering embers. He called out again, louder this time, but still there was no response. It was as if the world had gone completely still. His mind raced as he quickly removed his pajamas, put on his sweater, and ran toward the cabin, but something stopped him. He felt the presence of something watching him. From the edge of the woods, a figure emerged. At first, Kyle thought it was just another shadow, a trick of the light, but then he saw it clearly. The creature was tall, unnaturally tall, and gaunt, with limbs that were too far from its body, far too long. Its skin was sickly pale, stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed faintly, like twin embers in the dark. Kyle's blood ran cold as he realized the creature was staring directly at him. The Wendigo. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment before it struck. The air around it felt cold, unnatural, as if all warmth had been drained from the world. The wind howled louder, but the Wendigo stood motionless, watching him with an unsatiable hunger in its eyes. Its mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that seemed too large for its face. Kyle didn't think. He just ran. His heart raced as he sprinted toward the cabin, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could hear the Wendigo's heavy footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, as if it had enjoyed the chase. His feet slipped on the ice, and he stumbled, but he pushed himself to keep moving. He finally reached the cabin and slammed the door shut behind him. Panting for breath, the others were still nowhere to be found. He searched the cabin frantically, calling out their names, but there was no answer. It was as if they had simply vanished. Desperation set in as he realized he was completely alone. The Wendigo had taken them, his friends, his companions. Kyle wasn't sure what happened to them, but he knew one thing for certain. They were no longer alive. For the next few days, Kyle wandered the frozen wilderness, unable to find the keys to the car that he drove here in, trying to find his way out. But the Wendigo was always close behind, its growls echoing through the trees, its eyes glowing in the distance. He can hear it moving in the shadows, always just out of sight. When Kyle finally managed to stumble back to civilization, he was a broken man. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, as if the terror he had experienced had drained the life from him. He told authorities what had happened, but they dismissed his story as a tale spun by a man who had spent too much time alone in the woods. No one believed him. They chalked it up to hallucinations or wild animal attacks. The police even dismissed it as fantasy, called him a lunatic. A few days later, police came to his door, asking him about the disappearances of his friends. Unsure whether or not to tell them what had truly happened, he mustered up the courage to say what had happened. After a month and 2 court trials, they were unable to prove the murders on Kyle. They chalked it up as animal attacks. But only Kyle knew the truth. Every winter, when the wind howls through the trees, Kyle hears the whispers of the Wendigo and the screams of his friends. It's still out there, waiting, always hungry, always watching. child knows that one day the creature will come for him again. So he vows to be ready.